I will begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining, and welcome to today's event, Arming Israel, U.S. Military Aid and the Assault on Gaza, with the Green Olive Collective and the American Friends Service Committee. My name is Erez Bleicher, and I'm the Membership and Advocacy Director of the Green Olive Collective, an advocacy, information, and tour guiding center committed to a democratic future and an end to the ongoing displacement of Palestinians. We provide communities around the world with insight into the oppressive policies of the occupation and the resources to engage in meaningful advocacy in solidarity with Palestinians. Your contributions for today's event will be split between AFSC and the Green Olive Collective and go to sustain both of our efforts to counter state violence, end weapons shipments, and international support for the assault on Gaza, fundamentally shift the landscape of discourse around Israel-Palestine, and advance an expansive and robust vision of justice. We need contributions from you, our wider community, in order to cover the costs of this event and sustain our work to amplify the voices of Palestinian and Israeli human rights defenders calling for a permanent ceasefire and an end to collective punishment. You can contribute at greenolivetours.com/contributions, which I put into the chat moments ago. We are honored today to host this event with the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization that has worked since 1917 to promote lasting peace with justice as a practical expression of faith in action. Drawing on continuing spiritual insights and working with people of many backgrounds, AFSC has worked for decades to advance social movements against mass incarceration, the militarization of police and borders, for the rights of immigrants and formerly incarcerated people, and for the rights of people under military occupation around the world. Our speaker today, Noam Perry, is the Strategic Research Coordinator of AFSC's Action Center for Corporate Accountability and one of the founders of Investigate, both initiatives that aim to expose, isolate, and reduce corporate complicity in state violence, and especially focus on corporations involved in incarceration and immigration detention, the Israeli occupation, and border industries. He will speak with us today about the role of the United States in arming the current military campaign in the Gaza Strip, how the military industry and arms trade function, and how we can hold corporations and governments accountable. Noam, thank you for your time and expertise. It's truly appreciated. I'm glad we can all be together today. The last thing I'll say before I think just passing to you is that as Noam begins to share with us about this topic, feel free as he speaks to share questions in the chat. Just write question at the beginning with a dash or a colon afterwards so I can spot it out, and I will collect the questions and hopefully integrate them into the question answer period at the end. So with that, sincere thanks, Noam, and I'll pass to you. Are you able to unmute?
Let's see. Can you hear me?
I can. Beautiful.
I'm able to unmute. Hi, everyone. It's very good to see you all. I'm very happy to be here despite the circumstances. Let's see if I can share my screen, because I did prepare some slides just to share some. Can you all see this?
We can.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, I not to repeat too much of what Erez said, I work for an organization called the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker organization, even though I'm not Quaker myself. I'm actually Jewish from Israel originally. And my plan is to share some general thoughts and trends that we've observed doing this work for the last 5-6 months now, and give it some context, and then really spend a lot of time answering your questions and see where you want to take this conversation. And the American Friends Service Committee has actually been doing this work and very similar work for a while. We used to have a program called NARMIC, National Action Research on the Military Industrial Complex, that started during the war in Vietnam. And at that time, it was a challenge, before computers, was a challenge just to figure out who are the main defense contractors. So they did work in libraries and archives just to uncover that. Today, it's kind of, it's a lot more streamlined. But that was a major project. And then when the war in Vietnam ended, they turned to expose other industries and looking into, for example, how the US high-tech industry is potentially violating the arms embargo on South Africa. Unfortunately, this is very similar work that we still are doing, what is it now, 40, 50 years later. Today, we have our main resource on these issues is called Investigate. This is the URL. And we track routinely three separate issues. One is the Israeli occupation. You can see it at the top under research. The other is the US prison industry. So that includes companies that run prisons, companies that use prison labor, anything that relates to that. And what we call the borders industry, which is really anything that has to do with the US-Mexico border, construction, surveillance on the border, also surveillance of immigrant communities within the United States, deportation industries, and all of that. Part of the research on the Israeli occupation, of course, relates to weapons companies and companies that provide Israel with militarized services and militarized equipment that we keep seeing in operating in Gaza every few years. Of course, today's work is what's happening today is unprecedented. But unfortunately, this is not the first time this is happening, right? So we actually have been tracking the weapons being used on the people in Gaza and the West Bank by Israel since our project started. Investigate started around 2012, and there were multiple massive assaults on Gaza. Again, not at the scale of the current one, but each time we tracked the weapons that are being used and the companies that produce them, because my project specifically is about corporate accountability. And so it's important for us to name, expose, and target the companies that are providing these weapons to Israel. That's apart from targeting the US government, which is, of course, playing a much more major role. And we have people doing that as well. But my work specifically is about the research into the companies involved. Which brings me to this moment. This is Rifat El-Arir. He was a good friend. He was a poet and a professor of English in Gaza City. He was one of the most prominent voices of Palestinians living in Gaza. This is a picture that he tweeted in November of US made. It says, you can see made in US. It was very important for him that we know that it's the USA that is harming his people. This was taken he took this picture in the UN school that his kid used to go to. And unfortunately, Rifat was killed, probably targeted by Israel, even though we can never be 100% sure. He wrote this poem that became very famous. I don't know, maybe some of you encountered it, about what should happen if he dies, because he received a lot of death threats from Israeli phone numbers before he died, so he kind of knew it was coming. And he asked us to keep the story alive and to keep doing this work. And so that's what we are doing. His daughter and newborn granddaughter, which he never met, were killed just last week in another bombing. So this is part of my and my organization's motivation for doing this work. Rifat participated with us. The book in this picture here, Gaza Writes Back, is a project that we did with him and his students several years ago, and this newer book that he's holding here is a newer version or a newer book that he contributed to that you can get actually for free now. Not the hard copy, but you can get a digital copy for free. This was before the genocide started, so it's about Gaza as of a year and a half ago. We also, I already saw in the chat, some people are interested in AFSC's work in Gaza and the West Bank in general. We have staff in Gaza right now. They're doing humanitarian relief work and some other stuff. I'm happy to share more about that if you want in the Q&A section. But I'm going to turn out to really talk about what we're seeing in terms of the U.S. arming Israel, which is what brought us here today. So this is our newer resource. You have the URL at the bottom. And here we specifically track the weapons and companies that we see being used in Gaza and elsewhere by Israel right now, in this moment. In the last 6 months, we published the first version of this list in November, and it keeps growing as we see more weapons being used, as we find more evidence. Sometimes, people find things in the rubble that were used months ago, but we just now figure out what it is. And so this is another resource that you feel free to browse. I'll just give some examples here, but the full list is there online for everyone to see. And of course, the context of how the US is arming Israel is also not new. This is not something that just happened just in the last year. I'm sure a lot of you know that the United States is giving Israel $3.8 billion a year. In the last few years, it used to be a little bit less. And Israel is the largest recipient historically of military assistance from the United States. It used to be that Israel topped the list every year, and since Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine tops the list in the last couple of years, but Israel still is the overall receiver of military assistance in the last 70 years or so. And there's a lot of secrecy, actually, about what the United States is sending Israel right now. They have become very guarded. Like I said, we've been doing this work for years, and every round of major assault on Gaza, 2008, 2011, 2014, and the smaller ones as well. Each time we track the weapons, and we track shipments, and we track contracts, and each time it actually becomes harder. And this time around, it's the hardest it's been. The United States government has been very guarded and secretive deliberately about what it's sending. So here's what we know. And like I said, that page that I offered earlier has a lot more information. But in a nutshell, we know that there was a major aerial convoy of more than 200 US cargo planes landing in Israel almost on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times a day, between October and December. Some of it still continues, but at a much lower rate. We know there was a report that between October and March of this year, the United States approved about 100 or more than 100 military sales of military equipment and weapons to Israel. But the way the laws are structured, they don't have to actually disclose each and every sale. So there's a threshold of $100 million. And above that, they do have to disclose to Congress, and then, of course, it becomes public. So the only public disclosures that have been made since October are these two sales, the 14,000 tank rounds and about 57,000, sorry, 14,000, not 1,400, 14,000 tank rounds and 57,000 artillery shells, 155 millimeter artillery shells. Both of these were above the threshold, so the administration had no choice but to disclose them. I'm sure they would not have disclosed them if they had a way not to. And you can see on the right is an example of a picture. Because there's no disclosures, we have to rely on other sources. So of course we look at all the disclosures that the United States government is putting out, but we also find information in other places. This is an example of a tweet by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. that it doesn't say what these are, but we have some experience and we can identify what these small armed vehicles are. So we collect information from social media. We collect, of course, everything that Palestinians in Gaza are finding in the rubble. And there was another not really formal notification, but the United States government did acknowledge in March, a couple of months ago, that it is also fulfilling now orders from previous notifications to Congress, sometimes ones that date back to 2008. So they said, oh, we don't need to notify again Congress because these are fulfillments of old notifications. And we know some of these include 2,000 pound, these are so-called dumb bombs, unguided bombs. The MK-84 and the MK-82 is the smaller version, the 500 pound bombs. And they also said they're fulfilling now in selling Israel a new squadron of F-35 fighter jets. These are the most advanced weapon systems in the world, these F-35. Now, what do these weapons do? So the MK-84 2,000 pound bomb is actually one of the largest bombs in the Israeli arsenal. Whenever you see craters of that magnitude, of this size, created by a bomb, it's most likely that. This is a picture from November, when Israel was still doing massive aerial bombings. There were massive pictures of craters of this size, and we have military experts that say, knowing what we know about the Israeli arsenal, the only weapon that can create this size of a crater is the 2,000 pound bomb, the MK-84. And more recently, in the last, about a month ago, there was a massive reveal of how Israel uses AI, artificial intelligence, to create targets at an unprecedented rate, thousands of targets. We know actually that most of it is done in-house. The programming of these AI capabilities is done in-house by the Israeli intelligence community, but you also have some logos here of companies that we know right now are providing Israel with technologies that have AI capabilities and software, and we don't know for sure what the link is, but we suspect that some of this is linked. And if you only have time to read one thing, I really recommend this article, "The Mass Assassination Factory" by 972. It's chilling. I mean, the level of sophistication in creating deliberate destruction was surprising to me. I can say that, which tells you something. What we learned from that article, for example, is that Israel prefers to use, again, so-called dumb bombs, unguided bombs, to target lower level suspected terrorists and their families. So, for example, if they had intelligence suggesting that a residential building has one, let's say, person that they suspected belonged to Hamas or Islamic Jihad or another militant group, they would prefer target the whole building with a so-called dumb bomb, with an unguided bomb, which would destroy the whole building, and they saved their more accurate weapons for higher level military commanders in Palestinian armed groups, which, if you think about it, is really the reverse logic of international humanitarian law. There's a principle called the proportionality principle. It says that the so-called collateral damage needs to be proportionate to the military advantage created by the attack. And it seems like they operated on the flip side of that. So the lower level militants were actually targeted by weapons that create more collateral damage. That was surprising to me, and I think to many others. there's a whole other level of secrecy happening that I can't talk about much because we really don't know much. The United States has military stockpiles with ammunition and other equipment in several places around the world. One of them is in Israel, in presumably several locations that are undisclosed. I have guesses, but they're really unsubstantiated, so I don't want to say anything about that. But it's a black hole for us. There's no disclosures whatsoever about what they hold, what the inventory is, how much Israel can take out of it, what level of permission Israel needs. Everything about this is unclear. The only thing that we know was one report that there was a weapon shipment that was supposed to go to Ukraine that the United States decided on, I believe, in March of last year, before October. And that was from this pile, the stockpile in Israel of 155 millimeter artillery shells. And once October happened, they decided to cancel that and to keep, or either to keep the weapons in Israel or to redivert them to Israel. We don't even know how that works. So comparing all that secrecy, for example, to the level of transparency that we have with Ukraine, right? This is an official page from the US State Department. It's actually longer than this. This is just what I could fit in this slide, but it's a very long list and itemized, almost like a receipt of how many units of each weapon system divided into categories. So obviously this is something that the United States is not trying to hide versus what it's sending to Israel, which it is trying to hide. And I think it's a good question, why? And I think we all know why, but it's an interesting and stark difference there. Another thing which is related but also different. This is a graph that we produced showing the exports of firearms, of small firearms, from the United States to Israel. And you can see the major spike in October. There was a similar spike in November. And this is not going necessarily to the Israeli military. Unlike in the United States and many other militaries, the Israeli military doesn't issue a handgun to most of its soldiers. So soldiers in the Israeli military typically carry assault rifles. They don't have a standard issue handgun, which means that most of this export goes to civilians, Israeli civilians. We know there was a massive spike in Israeli requests to get licenses. Again, unlike in the United States, you have to have a license in Israel to carry a weapon. And the vast majority of weapons, of handguns that arrive in Israel are made in the United States. There are a few smaller Israeli manufacturers and a few smaller European manufacturers, but the vast majority are US companies that you all know, like Colt, Sig Sauer, and etc. The guy here on the right, by the way, in case folks don't know, is the Minister of Police or of National Security in Israel. Really crazy, horrible right-wing, the most right-wing person probably in the government right now. And then going back to government sales to the military, this is more latest news. Probably folks, I'm assuming, have heard about this. There was a new bill that was approved by the Senate a long time ago and then approved by the House and signed by President Biden on the 24th, just a week ago, a little bit more than a week ago, adding another $14 billion to the what's called the foreign military financing. That's on top of the regular $3.8 billion. And also, this was not just for Israel, this was also I mean, the 14 billion is for Israel, but a part of that package was also more weapons for Ukraine and Taiwan. And we also have a report of a pending notification of a sale of a new squadron of F-15 fighter jets. It's not clear exactly what's happening with that. It was supposed to be declared. It hasn't been. We're not exactly sure why. But that is all still pending. What does it all mean for us? We've said since the beginning that Israel relies on U.S. weapons. Of course, I don't think I've mentioned that, but there are other countries that arm Israel. Germany, the UK. There are some other countries that provide components to weapons. Italy, Sweden. But by and large, this is a US operation. I mean, one statistics from last year said 70% of the weapons that Israel receives is from the United States. And some Israeli officials have been very open that not only does Israel routinely rely on US funding for its military, but right now, if the United States decided to enforce its own laws, actually, there are laws on the books in the United States that should prevent this from happening, and they're not applied to Israel. If the United States decided to apply these laws and stop some of the sales and transfers to Israel, then Israel would not be able to sustain what it's doing in Gaza right now. What does that mean? It means that the United States has a tremendous amount of responsibility for what's happening. And when people say things like Genocide Joe, it's because of that. It's because we know that without the support of this administration, less people in Gaza would have been killed. It's plain as simple as that. So maybe I'll stop there and we'll see. I can talk about anything that I just covered a lot more. But I really want to spend a lot of time hearing what you want to ask and what you want to say, and I can share more then. I'll stop sharing my screen maybe.
Thanks, Noam, much appreciated. And both, the precision of information and the comprehensive overview is really helpful and staggering. It's so difficult to take stock of what billions means and what the impact of these military shipments and weapon shipments is practically on the ground. Devastating. I have several questions myself, but I want to first give it over to the questions from people who have joined today. So first, there was a question from Julie Beer related to international law, and I'll see now if I can unmute Julie if you want to ask yourself the question. If you're here, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll read the question on your behalf. Are you here?
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey, go ahead, we can hear you.
We can hear you. Thanks for your question. Do you want to ask it directly to Noam?
Hello.
Seems difficult to hear, unfortunately. So I'll just go ahead and read what you wrote. Julie said, how can the US justify sending 2,000-pound bombs after seeing the massive destruction in Gaza? Isn't this in violation of international law? And I guess I wanted to start there and ask you to share any more perspective you have about the role of international law or the relationship it has or doesn't have to US policy and the arming of the current military campaign in Gaza.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of Americans on this call and a lot of Europeans and non-Americans. The United States, I'm trying to say it as gently as I can. The United States does not care about international law. That's just a fact. It does what it can to shape international law to fit its own needs as the most powerful country in the world, but it has no intention ever to follow international law when it restricts its own conduct. And that's documented. I mean, it's the United States government saying repeatedly, whenever the United States signs an international treaty, there's always a clause, always, saying, we will follow this. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it says we will follow this treaty to the extent that the United States Constitution, says, which means U.S. law prevails. The interesting thing here, for me, is that this is not only a violation of international law, this is a violation of U.S. law. There are multiple mechanisms that the United States government has on the books. You might have heard of the Leahy laws. You might have heard of National Security Memorandum 20 that President Biden signed after October. I don't remember when it was signed. I think November or December. That is supposed to restrict the sale and transfers of military of weapons that are, if they're not used, if there's credible information that they're not used in accordance to U.S. policy and U.S. law and international law, international humanitarian law. And whenever there's a mechanism like that, there are other mechanisms that the United States government has. For all of these mechanisms, we know, again, it was revealed multiple times that there is a double standard, that the United States has a way to apply these for, most of the world, and it sets up a different mechanism in order to not apply it to Israel. How can they justify it? I don't know. That's a political question that I'm not very equipped to answer, I think. But that's what they do. That's what they do. They shield Israel from criticism at UN proceedings. They actively protect Israel from being from applying U.S. law to Israel. Sometimes they do it legally, because sometimes there's a provision in the law that says the president can override certain mechanisms if there's a national security interest, blah, 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 something like that. And sometimes they do it illegally just because they can, and because we have no way of penetrating that realm. It's a black box, unless someone leaks information from within, which has happened more than once. But unless that happens, we have no way of knowing. This is all inside the US government. We had several people who resigned and told us how this works, which is how I know most of what I know. Josh Paul, maybe you've heard, is the most, the loudest of them. But yeah, how they justify it, they don't.
Important questions and important to take stock of. Continuing from this, I guess there were several questions people have posed also asking about companies and corporations. And you've spoken not exclusively, but disproportionately about the US government in the last words you shared. I guess shifting it to the business end, can you talk about how this relates to arms manufacturing, manufacturing deals with the government of the US or Israel? Who are the companies involved, and what's the link between government policy and companies?
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually my usual spiel that I somehow skipped this time. So the corporations involved, yes, absolutely, very important. Just a few examples. Boeing famously makes multiple types of weapons that Israel uses. And with relation to these large crater that we saw in the Jabalia refugee camp, they make these kits called JDAM kits that that make unguided bombs into guided bombs. And but by the way, everything I'm saying right now is on that page that I shared earlier with all the companies that has a lot more information that I'm able to share in a presentation like this. But that's one of the companies I would highlight. Another company is General Dynamics. General Dynamics has a virtual monopoly in the United States on making artillery shells, 155 millimeter artillery shells. Also, the bodies of these MK bombs, the metal bodies of the bombs is what General Dynamics does in two factories in New Jersey, and I think another one in Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken. General Dynamics reported a spike in its share price right after October, as did Raytheon or RTX, which is its new name. Raytheon makes Iron Dome interceptors. Iron Dome is the Israeli defense, one of the layers of the Israeli defense system. And the interceptors or the rockets for that systems are made by RTX or Raytheon here in the United States. Lockheed Martin, of course, the largest weapons manufacturer in the world, makes the F-35 fighter bombs themselves, and the F-16 fighter jets that Israel uses. Boeing, that I already mentioned, makes the F-15 fighter jets. So the involvement of the U.S. weapons or arms industry is clear and documented, and they're not hiding anything. They're very proud, actually, of the weapons that they're producing. We track all the sales that we can find in that page and previous ones on Investigate. Sometimes the more interesting things is to track companies that are not necessarily weapons companies, right? Because you know, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, that's what they do. That's their core business. But a company like Caterpillar, which is my favorite example in recent months, is a company that we know from farming equipment. You know, they make bulldozers, tractors, heavy machinery used for construction. And we know for decades that Israel has been using these things to demolish Palestinian homes in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. There was the very famous case in 2003 when a bulldozer killed the American peace activist Rachel Corrie, that led to a campaign in the United States that is still ongoing more than 20 years later. And there are several things to say specifically about Caterpillar bulldozers. First of all, it's not just that Israel uses, you know, buys an equipment that the same level of equipment that civilians would buy in the United States. It's that the representative of Caterpillar in Israel modifies it's called D9 bulldozers, and makes them armored, militarized, weaponized systems specifically for the use of the Israeli military. We know from back in the assault on Gaza in 2008, we know that Caterpillar employees in Israel were drafted into the military in order to maintain and support the usage of these bulldozers in the front line in Gaza. And we know from now there are countless pictures of these bulldozers going alongside the Israeli tanks as they go to flatten residential neighborhoods in Gaza. Some of you might have heard of the perimeter zone that Israel is now establishing or finished establishing, the 1 kilometer inside the Gaza Strip along the border. That was done using Caterpillar bulldozers. Same for the new road that Israel constructed, dissecting Gaza into north and south. There's like a new Israeli road now with places for the military to arrange itself as needed, with surveillance equipment, with everything. That was also done using Caterpillar bulldozers. So these are just a few examples. I can give many more if folks are interested.
Thank you for that. I've seen the Caterpillar bulldozers also in the process of demolishing homes in Masato Yatta and the South Urban Hills in Area C of the West Bank. And as you were talking, part of what I was thinking about, and I think is so important in the information you give us, is how it translates into the reality on the ground, which is understandably so difficult to grasp. All of these things can seem so abstract. But these are people's lives. This isn't an abstraction. This is ongoing policy for decades now, and in a way we haven't seen before, specifically in Gaza in the last half year. And what this means for people on the ground, but also the repercussions internationally, is really staggering to take account of. I wanted to ask a clarifying question that I've been wondering lately. You said that 70% of weapons that are imported, I think, are from the US. I think I've seen lately that 30% also from Germany, but I'm not sure about the statistics. I guess I just wanted to clarify how much of the weaponry that the IDF or Israel has is imported. Does Israel manufacture also its own weaponry? Is that 70% of total weapons, or what's the percentage coming in from abroad versus manufactured locally?
Yeah, terrific question. The 70%, or I think it was actually 69% statistic, came from a report that was published recently by the Stockholm Institute. It's called SIPRI. I forget the full acronym, but this is an organization that does. Remember the list that I showed you in the beginning of the 100 defense contractors that AFSC used to publish decades ago? This is what SIPRI does every year now. They publish a list of all of the top 100 arms manufacturers, and also a database of arms transfers. And of course, this is all relying on open source information, so it's only the known part. It's like whatever is disclosed. And the 70% is from the report that just came out about 2023. And yes, it's only for the weapons that Israel imports, not the weapons that Israel manufactures itself. And it said about 70% comes from the United States, about 30% come from Germany. And the Germany, and this is, it's 70% of the value, right? It matters how you measure these things. Are you measuring, kilograms of explosives? Are you measuring value? They measure it by value. And the reason Germany is so high is just because what Israel buys from Germany is very, very expensive. So there was a major deal of submarines that have been reported to be Israel's nuclear submarines, and they just cost a lot of money, and they come from Germany. So other than that, what Germany sends Israel is actually not a lot. There were some disclosures, some reporting about smaller things that we know now come from Germany, but most of the bulk of the value is because of those submarines. The other part of the question, yes, Israel, of course, produces weapons itself. There are 3 large weapons manufacturers in Israel. One is private, it's called Elbit Systems, and the 2 others are state-owned, owned by the government. And the one is called Rafael, and the other is called Israeli Aerospace Industries. Again, these are all listed on the page that I shared before. I can't answer the question of how much of Israel's weapons are Israeli made and how much is imported. Everything about that in Israel is classified information. So we know the defense budget, so we can say how much of it comes from the United States, or what percentage the United States contributes. I think last time I checked, it was about, I forget, I shouldn't just name numbers. It wasn't the majority, right? But also, a lot of the Israeli defense budget doesn't go to buying weapons. It goes to salaries. That's always a major component of the budget. It goes to many other things. But we don't know how much overall, how much weapons the Israeli military buys in Israel. We know it's a lot. Probably more, I hesitate to guess, but probably more than what it's buying abroad. But I can't prove that. And I don't know to say if it's 50-50 or more. We just have no way. We know of specific sales. Companies sometimes put out a press release. We just won a contract to provide this amount of weapons for this amount of money because it's good for their shareholders, specifically Elbit Systems, because the other ones are not traded, so they don't have shareholders to report to. But this is what we know. We just know glimpses. In the case of the United States, because number one, because the United States government shares more information in general than Israel about its defense systems. And secondly, because this has to be appropriated by Congress and therefore there's congressional disclosures, we actually know more about what Israel has from US sources than from Israeli sources. But yeah, absolutely. I can say, the Israeli drones, for example, are made in Israel. All the killer drones, all the surveillance drones, I don't know of a single drone that Israel buys in the United States. A lot of missile systems are produced in Israel. Sometimes they actually develop a system in Israel and then manufacture it in the United States in order to be able to buy them with US military funding. Because one of the major provisions is that the United States money, the 3.8 and now the 14 billion additional, most of it has to be used in the United States. So it's a subsidy for the US arms industry in a way. Israel has to buy American weapons. And therefore, the fact that RTX or Raytheon makes the Iron Dome missiles in the United States, it's only because it has an agreement with Rafael, which is the Israeli company that developed them, to make them in the United States so that Israel could buy them in the United States. There are more examples like that. There's an Israeli company that makes a light armored vehicle. It's an Israeli company based in Israel, and it bought a factory in Alabama in order to produce those armored vehicles in the United States so that Israel could buy them using US dollars, because that gives them an edge. Then Israel is much more likely to buy them than if they were producing them in Israel. It's really a twisted system.
That symbiotic relationship, yeah, very troubling. Takes that up and very sinister in effect. But helpful context. Because we don't have so much time, I want to try to get to some of the other things I've been asked. A few people asked different things about lobbying and the effect of AIPAC, for example, on US government decisions. For me, I've also become more and more aware in the last years that lobbies like CUFI, Christians United for Israel, are much more numerous and well-funded than AIPAC. For example, I believe CUFI has more members in the United States than there are Jewish people in the United States. So on different fronts, I don't know exactly what's in or without of your field of expertise either, but I'm sure people here would be interested in your thoughts and perspective through your research.
Yeah, AIPAC is absolutely a problem. CUFI is a larger problem, I agree. But also the weapons industry, they have lobbyists. They're not silent on this issue. By and large, again, to put it plainly and bluntly, the United States supports Israel. It doesn't need necessarily AIPAC in order to do it. It supports Israel as a blanket statement. Biden doesn't need AIPAC to continue doing this, for example. So do most of our elected representatives in the Senate and in the House. What we see now is actually some cracks in the system. I mean, the level of discussions that are happening now are truly unprecedented. They're not enough. They're not even starting to be enough. But, we just got I lost track. Oh yeah, Kufe, sorry. Christian United for Israel. Yeah, sorry, I'm not really following the chat. It's really hard to speak and follow at the same time, but sometimes I see something. What was I saying? Just a couple of weeks ago, for the first time, it appeared that the United States has applied the Leahy law that I alluded to, that I talked about earlier, which is supposed to prevent the US from sending weapons to countries or specific military units that violate international humanitarian law. It seems to have been applied for the first time to Israel in the last few months, and then it was not, and then it was de-applied. But this was not something that would have been possible last year. The latest supplemental funding of the $14 billion that was approved a week and a half ago, there were 37, I believe, Congress people who voted against it. Unprecedented numbers. Of course, they're still a tiny minority, but I think we're starting to see cracks in the system. I think the students are leading the way in the last week. The student encampments. Part of my job is also to work with students on divestment. And what they are managing to do right now is something that that the student movement in the United States has tried to do for, again, about 20 years now. And only now we see universities actually starting to divest. So I can't really say I'm hopeful because it's a drop in the bucket. But I think things are changing, honestly.
That's heartening. And of course, seeing the mass mobilizations around the world and in the United States is heartening. I guess along those lines, and of course, it's also a question that's been asked. How can we participate in continuing in that direction? What can be done to hold corporations and governments accountable? What are different things in AFSC or in general that you think can be done as part of efforts to end this total impunity and buying of arms in this context?
Absolutely. I mean, there are actually so many ways to plug in. It really relies on where you are and what your capabilities and capacities are. I think there's a role for all of us to play. And I think the main thing is to organize with others. Don't do something on your own just because you think it's a good idea. Trust the movements around us that people have thought about this, people are strategizing, people are thinking about different options. And you should try to find those people around you, an organization, a movement, a group, and not try to reinvent the wheel. That's the first thing I would say. My organization, American Friends Service Committee, we have since November, we have what's called an action hour each week on Fridays. You can join us. Typically, we take action during our calls. We give some context about what's happening, and then we ask people to take action in the call. Sometimes it's to call our Congress people. If this is relevant mostly for people in the United States. Sometimes it's something else. But that's the best way to plug into what we are doing on everything, what my organization is doing on everything. I think in Europe, there's more opening to actually hold governments and corporations accountable in the legal system. And we have people working on that. So if this is your thing, I'm sure you can find them. And if not, maybe I can help point you to them. I think wherever you are, if you are a member of an organization, maybe you teach at a college, maybe you're part of a union, maybe you are, I don't know, you go to church or a different religious institution. Wherever you are, you can think about activating that body to take a stand and to do something. The Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions from 2005 calls on us, on everyone, to think about how we are already involved. What are the ties that link us to the occupation, to the apartheid system, and then to sever these ties. So for a university, it can look like selling some stocks. For a union, it can look like selling stocks or bonds. Many US unions, for example, are invested in Israel bonds, as I'm sure some of you might know. For a church, again, it can be an act of divestment from its investments. It can be a statement of solidarity. It can be actually going to Palestine and support Palestinians. I don't know if your organization does that, but there are solidarity visits. Palestinians, not to Gaza, I wouldn't go to Gaza right now, but in the West Bank, people are craving our attention, in the global north. They want us to be there. They need us to be there. They need us to protect them from violence by the Israeli military and settlers in the West Bank. And they are calling on us to go. So maybe you can go. Maybe you can't go, but you can fund someone who could go, who doesn't have the means to go. You know, I think we can all play a role, and I don't think I think there are too many options, honestly. But you should each find the thing that you can do and do it. As long as you do it in accordance with some other group that does that. You know, don't just do your own thing and expect it to have an impact in the world, because what we do in our home, if nobody hears about it, doesn't change the world.
Thanks, Noam. And so important, the emphasis on collective action and mass mobilization and being part of collective movements and communities that can advance justice and cultivate the power necessary to act effectively and strategically. Yeah, people should definitely reach out either to Noam or to AFSC in general if they're interested in participating in any of the initiatives Noam has mentioned. And I know AFSC has been doing this work for a long time, also with the Apartheid Free Communities Project. The Green Olive Collective is bringing people on the ground in solidarity with Palestinians in the West Bank, Jerusalem, also in 48 in the Negev and Mecca Desert. And we have a next solidarity mission that, as of now, 6 people are joining in May. And if anybody wants to join, though, at this point, I know it's a short few weeks away, please do come. It's necessary. And the communities on the ground in Area C and in the South Hebron Hills are asking for solidarity, protective presence, accompaniment, etc. Also, we'll be starting a new solidarity network and initiative with solidarity circles around the world in the coming weeks, next month. So pay attention to that, and it'll be a way also to connect with the reality on the ground from wherever you are. And more information will be sent shortly. Noam, unfortunately, we're close to out of time. I guess I wanted to end by looping back to where you began with your relationship and friendship with Fatah Larayu, and what it means to be accountable to those most affected and impacted. My friend Khalil Abu Yahya would also send messages in the first months after October saying that there are American-made planes, F-16s, conducting the airstrikes above him. And I guess I just wanted to ask, because all of this can seem so abstract, and even when the analysis and data is so informative, what are people in AFSC, you said, who are doing work on the ground, saying, how do we connect this to what's actually at stake? And then if you want to share any last thoughts or words about what's important or what keeps you motivated, also grounded in doing this work and then pursuing a future.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I'm Israeli. You know, I served in the military. So what keeps me motivated is very personal and very, I have a deep sense of commitment to remediate some of the harm that I've done. What keeps me grounded might not be applicable for everyone, but I have 2 kids at home. They keep me grounded. That's the best I can offer on that front. Yeah, our staff in Gaza, we have a program in Gaza since 1948, actually. AFSC had a history of supporting refugee resettlement in Europe after World War II, and won a Nobel Peace Prize for that work. And then when the war broke in 1948, and there was 700,000 Palestinian refugees, the United Nations was a nascent organization. It had no capacity to deal with that. So it asked AFSC and the Red Cross to support the refugees. AFSC got the Gaza Strip part, and the Red Cross got the West Bank part. And they did that work. They did humanitarian work, supporting the refugee camps in Gaza. And after a couple of years, they did something which no humanitarian organization, I think, does ever. The AFSC staff on the ground said, actually, this is not a humanitarian crisis, this is a political crisis, and we don't want to be a part of it. You know, this crisis could be solved if Israel lets these people return home. Israel has no intention of doing that. We do not want to be a part of this protracted refugee crisis that is man-made. And we pulled out. But we kept a program there. We have a program supporting youth in Gaza. That's what the program did for decades. And we have many youth that lost. Luckily, none of them got killed as far as I know. And our staff is alive and fine. They lost a lot of family members. But they've, of course, transitioned from doing youth work to supporting aid. So some of the food trucks that managed to get in were coordinated by us, and not by me specifically, but my colleagues. And then we did some other things. So again, to honor Rifat, because of his poem about the kite, we had a kite making event in Gaza that was accompanied with kite making events in the United States. And we saw that people in Gaza were craving those connections to the West. They don't want to be seen as miserable people and only victims. They want us to see them as freedom and life-loving people. And so the latest thing we did just less than a week ago was the soccer game, football in Europe, soccer in the United States. Soccer game in Rafah between the tents of the refugees, and accompanied again by soccer matches in the United States to raise awareness and raise money, and also just to show us that these are just people who live there and need our help, and they're not that different from us, actually. Yeah, that's what keeps me motivated.
Thanks, Noam. Very moving. And I'm deeply appreciative, and I know everyone here is deeply appreciative of the work you and AFSC does, and it's really inspiring to hear. And I felt very grounded on this call by your clear-sightedness and by just the comprehensive information that, of course, has taken you and many others much effort to cultivate, to be able to resource others with, so that we can create meaningful interventions towards the futures we want. So thank you so much for that. With that, unfortunately, we have to close for today. Thank you for all your perspective and the valuable insight you gave and the clarity and vulnerability with which you shared. And I want to thank everyone here on behalf of the Green Olive Collective and American Friends Service Committee for joining this event from around the world. As I mentioned at the start of the event, we depend on contributions from you, our wider community, to cover the costs of our events and sustain our work to fundamentally shift the landscape of discourse around Israel-Palestine and raise local and transnational awareness about the violence of military rule and occupation. And you can contribute at greenolivetours.com/contributions, which I put into the chat a moment ago. And today, your contributions will be split with AFSC and also sustain their invaluable work to promote movements against mass incarceration, the militarization of police and borders, for the rights of immigrants and formerly incarcerated people, and for the rights of people under military occupation. Your contributions will allow the Green Olive Collective to develop global campaigns, encouraging people around the world to take action in 2024. They will allow us to sustain our material support for communities facing displacement in Area C, to sustain a robust infrastructure for solidarity, advocacy, and action in the coming year, and launch new international campaigns in direct support of communities facing land expropriation and settler violence in the West Bank, including the Solidarity Circles and the new Solidarity Network we'll be launching next month. Keep an eye out for that. And we are hosting solidarity missions in 2024, advancing empathy, solidarity across borders, and a democratic future. Our next mission is at the end of this month, and registration is still open. Anyone interested can learn more at the link I'm about to place in the chat. And we would love to have you join for this meaningful work in support of the communities on the ground in the South Ariata and the South Amman Hills, in either refugee camp and in other places. We have deep relationships with. Moment. And I'll close today by saying that we hope you'll take what you heard today from Noam as a charge towards action in a moment in which we as a global community must do, of course, everything we can to demand an immediate ceasefire and a future of equality between all inhabitants of Israel-Palestine. Now is the time to write your elected officials, sign petitions, demonstrate, attend town halls, disrupt meetings, act in civil disobedience, share what you learned today from Noam with your peers, and do all we can to amplify the voices of Palestinians and Israelis calling for a lasting peace, equality, and a universal right to home and safety. So with that, I hope everyone here has good and peaceful days, and we send all of our support to all of you around the world acting and speaking out for justice. We will send a recording of this and also resources tomorrow, and much thanks. Have wonderful days and see everyone very soon. Thank you, Noam.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Hope to talk soon.